All right, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 9, the full chapter. And I'll go ahead and read it for us. And David said, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar." Then the king David sent and brought him from the house of Machir and the son of Amiel at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both feet. This is the word of the Lord. Promises are bold and powerful things. In many ways, they can make or break you. Promises we make to other people are often how we're remembered, right? Joyously for the promises you kept, or angrily for the promises you broke. Even the promises we make to ourselves are just as powerful. We'll start working out this year, and then 3 months in, we've gained 10 pounds. We're angry at ourselves, and so we either angry eat or depressed eat. Mine is usually depressed eat. Or I'll spend more time with my family this holiday season, and 3 months in, you realize you haven't seen your kids or your parents in a long time, and you're angry at yourself for the promise you broke to yourself. Now, there are promises that we do that we keep, right? Like, I'll do better. I'll be more. I'll work on X, Y, or Z thing, and you do. Promises can rebuild, but they can also destroy just as easily. And I believe that we see the power of a promise today in our passage. It may take some work to get there, but by God's grace, I hope I can show it to you today. But before we kind of get there, I want to take a quick step back and say that this passage that we're reading from chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 9, is an outlier where it lands. Kind of struck me. The passage before and after speak of wars David had to fight to unite Israel and keep it safe. Yet here we have a passage speaking about David fulfilling his covenant to Jonathan, which led me to ask why. And after 3 drafts of this sermon, a lot of soul searching, I feel the author dropped it in here to show what the heart of God's anointed king really is, to give us a foreshadowing of what a greater king has also fulfilled for us and will fulfill for us. Thus, what I want us to see and what I want to try to argue today, and hopefully we gather from, is that we should have faith in God's anointed king. We should have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises. Have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises. Now you might be wondering, well, why can we have faith? I believe we see that in our passage in 3 sections. We can have faith, verses 1 to 4, because there's a remembrance of a promise made. We can have faith, verses 5 to 11, because there's a reclamation of status. Not sure if that's a word, but we're using it. And then verses 12 to 13, we can have faith because there's a rejuvenation of a household. So why can we have faith? Because a remembrance of a promise made, reclamation of status, and a rejuvenation of a household. All right. So let us begin. Verse 1 to 4, remembrance of a promise made. Our passage begins with an and, signifying to me that this was attached to the previous passage in some form or fashion, where David defeated all these kingdoms around him that were trying to take down Israel. When he won, he justly dealt, well, justly is a strong word, but justly dealt with the losers and their spoils, dedicating the spoils to God and saving some of these warring kingdoms that he didn't have to save. And after that, after dedicating the spoils to God, he evenly spreads powerful positions in this new unified Israel that he's made to other men of Israel. And in the middle of all this, the last thing I would imagine to be on David's mind is a small promise he made years ago to a friend whose father tried to murder him for years. I mean, think about it. You're in the middle of moving to a new state. Let's just think about this in other terms. You're moving to a new state to start a new job, and you just got newly married. And in the middle of all that chaos, would you remember a promise you made to your nephew to give him a high five at a dinner party 5 years ago? And would you immediately then drop everything and go give him a high five? It's not a one-to-one comparison, but I think the idea still stands. In the face of everything David is dealing with, he remembers a covenant he made to Jonathan back in 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 to 17 and 42 is where you can find those, or where we see that. And he seems to immediately want to fulfill it. So as we see in our text, he calls for any servants of Saul's house to come forward. And Ziba, Saul's head servant, comes to him. And David questions if there is anyone of Saul's house left that he can fulfill his covenant to Jonathan for. To which Ziba replies, yes, there is one man left who is lame, or crippled. He's crippled in his feet, as it says in the end of verse 3. Which is a weird response, but hopefully it'll make more sense as we go along in this sermon. But to me, this is remarkable, right? The amount of things I forget is endless. The amount of promises I've made and forgotten, sadly, are probably more numerable than I want to admit to. Sometimes it is so easy to get caught up with what life throws at you that you forget the seemingly small things. And yet here David is, in the middle of wars, unifying a giant nation, and about to be in another war on the chapter that follows, and he remembers and acts on an old promise from years ago. It may seem small, but fellow leaders, preachers, and teachers here today, I hope your ministries are marked in the same way David's is here. I hope people remember you for the promises made, remembered, and fulfilled, especially in times of chaos like we are today with this pandemic. Because woe to the preacher, teacher, or leader who is remembered for all the promises they broke, who teaches their people by example that a promise is nothing but words meant to be forgotten or ignored. I feel like this happens a lot these days, and we need to be careful. And as we see throughout the Bible all the time, God takes his promises seriously, and so does, in this text, his anointed king. I hope you do too. Now you may be thinking, all right, great. Cool, Jeremy. What on earth does this have to do with having faith that the God's anointed king will fulfill his promises? And I'll admit this first point may be a bit of a stretch, but what's the first step to completing anything? And in my case, and I'm assuming many of your cases, it's remembering you have to do it. And here we see that God's anointed king, no matter how crazy his life is, no matter how many things are on his plate, he remembers the covenants he makes. So have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises. Now, not only does David remember this covenant, but in verses 5 to 11, we see a reclamation of status, is what I'm calling it. He helps the heir of Saul reclaim his status through the fulfillment of his promise. Right, after Ziba leaves to fetch this lame heir of Saul's house, we are met face to face with Mephibosheth, a young man whose feet are broken because of the fear of his nurse back in the day when both Jonathan and Saul died, which you can see in 2 Samuel chapter 4. He enters David's chambers and immediately falls on his face, as the text says, and paid homage. Now, I can only imagine what must be going through Mephibosheth's head right now. While we, the readers, know that David's going to show God's love to him and fulfill his covenant to Jonathan, Mephibosheth probably thinks that this is it, right? My grandfather turned on this man for years and hunted this man for years, killed a bunch of his kin, terrorized the nations because he didn't want to give up power, and now here is David to dole out my revenge, or the revenge towards him to me. I mean, this is just a guess, but from his actions, Mephibosheth's actions, to immediately fall on his face and not say anything, David's response in verse 7 to not fear, and then Mephibosheth's response in verse 8, calling himself a servant and a dead dog, what else could he be thinking, right? Yet that's not what happens. David announces that he's going to give Mephibosheth a place at David's table and restore all that was in Saul's house to him, which is absolutely crazy and probably to Mephibosheth feels like way more than he deserves because of his grandfather's atrocities. But still, David gives these two things. Right? I can just imagine that feeling Mephibosheth has. Right? I imagine maybe it's like when you're hard on cash and you don't know how you're going to pay that bill for next month, or you don't know how you're going to get your food, your next meal, and then out of nowhere this job or this sum of money comes in, and now you've got this, now you're able to eat. Maybe a more akin image or example would actually be a last-minute donor. I don't know what this is like, but I can imagine it's this euphoric moment where you get that kidney you need at the last second, where tomorrow you will see, right? It's this second life you didn't know you had or you didn't know was coming. This has to be a crazy moment for Mephibosheth. He went from being a part of one of the most feared and hated families to losing everything, to getting it all back and more. David has given him two huge things. The first of all was all that was in Saul's house: land for living, field for food, and staff to work all the fields, and land for the next generations to come. Now this was huge in this time, right? Status was seen by how much land you owned, how much food you produced, and how many people worked for you. But now that I think about that, not much has changed today. But without this, you were statusless, right? You were nobody. In a matter of seconds, David reverses this for Mephibosheth. Secondly, he gives Mephibosheth a place at his table where the king's children would sit and eat, as we see in verse 11. David basically adopts Mephibosheth as a son in his kingdom. So even without all the land given to Mephibosheth, he would have survived and prospered at the king's table. He would have been taken care of. So David goes a step above and beyond to fulfill his covenant with Jonathan. It's not just about sustaining Mephibosheth. It's about making sure Saul's line continues to fulfill that covenant. Again, I hope our ministries are marked with the same kindness and generosity. As shepherds, our sheep follow by example. If we don't ante up and adopt those who are hurting and lost, so to speak, into our house and our family, what will that do for our congregations or our ministries? We will have insular ministries that don't go out to proclaim the Christ and his gospel. We have ministries that close off and only help those already inside. We will have dead ministries. Why give? Why open your homes and churches to all peoples of the earth? Why sustain others in the church? Well, first of all, because they're all God's children. I think that's a simple one. But second, because that's the life of a Christian, the Christian call. And here, a Jewish man lives it out beautifully. So we should too. But how does any of this connect to my argument? Again, we're left with that question. I have faith that God's anointed, his anointed king, have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises. How does this connect to that argument, this point? Well, I'd argue if I were Mephibosheth, I wouldn't have trusted David, right? I would have had faith that, I wouldn't have had faith that he was going to be just to me, right? I'm Saul's grandson. I mean, imagine it. The world we live in loves to destroy and not forget. People love to be on top and use whoever they can to get there, and then they don't forget or forgive those who wrong them on the way to the top. I can't imagine being Mephibosheth and thinking that David would do right by me or things were okay when I was summoned to the throne room of the man my grandfather spent years trying to kill. And yet he does. And because of his faith, the most unlikely thing happens. God's anointed king reclaims his status. So why have faith? Well, because in the fulfillment of the promise, you will reclaim your status. And finally, we reach verses 12 to 13, and I promise this will be a bit shorter. But in 12 to 13, we see a rejuvenation of a household. Now, you may, again, be questioning, how is this different than the last point, status, reclamation of status? And I'll be honest, it isn't much, but I think it's something that David's reclamation of the status from Mephibosheth continued to produce. But to try to explain this better, I want to quickly look back and take a step back and look at the way Mephibosheth is constantly referred to as, or to put it another way, what always follows his name. Crippled and lame. It's weird that it keeps popping up. Even in 2 Samuel 4, when we first meet him in those short 2 to 3 verses, right, we see him become crippled, and then forever that is tagged next to his name. It's something that haunts him. I think it's continued to be talked about to show how unlikely what has happened to him was, but also how this blessing of David fulfilling his end of the covenant changed everything. Being lame or crippled in this time, I can only imagine, means a lot of things. Firstly, right, you probably couldn't work. You couldn't work fields or probably work anywhere, which means you couldn't own land or food, which means you couldn't provide for anyone or anything, which means you were the end of your line. Right? Who would marry someone, especially in these days with women and how few rights they had, more in Israel than everywhere else, but still how few rights or anything they had? What woman would marry a man who couldn't provide for her, couldn't sustain her, couldn't sustain his offspring? Right? From the day Mephibosheth was a young boy, these things were ripped from him, and his grandfather's downfall only made them worse for him. I'm not certain, I don't know from the text, but I can only imagine he probably didn't have much left if David had to restore it. But here we see, because of David's fulfilled covenant and going above and beyond, Mephibosheth has gotten married, right? We see this, or we can assume this from verse 12, because guess what? He has a son named Micah. He has an heir. Saul's house will live on in Israel. Why have faith in God's anointed king to fulfill his promises? Well, because, as we see here, faith not only provided a family status, it produced a lineage and rejuvenated the house of Saul. So should we put our faith in God's anointed king to fulfill his promises? Yes. But the question is, which one? David was a great king and did many amazing things, as we have seen through 1 Samuel and the start of 2 Samuel. But he's just a man. In 2 chapters, we see him fall to sin just like every other human in existence. Doesn't mean we can't learn from him, but to have the utmost faith in him would be foolish. David is a foreshadowing of a greater king, a greater anointed king. In this passage, he is an image of what a greater king will do to a greater level. He is a template in this passage for the position of God's anointed king lived right. Yes, David did some amazing things, but they're all ephemeral. They will fade away and decay with time. But what David does here shows us the nature of God's anointed king, and that he is fair and honest and beyond generous to us, and we can be sure that he will fulfill his promises. David, in a sense, was the pregame show to the main event, Jesus Christ. Jesus is the anointed king we need to put our faith in. But you might be wondering, how is Jesus better than David? I don't quite get that, and hopefully I can prove it to you and show it to you right now. Jesus didn't only fulfill promises that will fade, but he fulfilled promises that will last for eternity. Sin had a hold on all of us, but at the lowest point in Jesus' life, when he was strung up on a cross, he took the burden of the world's sin on his shoulders and paid for it. He won at the lowest moment. As it says in Galatians 5:1, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery." But not only that, not only did he free us from this sin of slavery, these chains of bondage that David was enslaved to and fell to in 2 chapters, chapter 11. Not only that, but his death, Jesus' death, with his death, he opened God to all peoples of the earth so that Jew and Gentile together could be God's people once again. As it says in Acts 28:28, therefore let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. And in this fulfillment of the covenant promise God made to Abraham, that he remembered and fulfilled through Jesus, we now have a new and better covenant that through faith alone we may enter the kingdom of God. We may return home. Through Christ's death, we now have a personal relationship with God. As Hebrews 9:15 says, therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. So why again is Jesus better? Well, because he's proof that God remembered the covenant he made to Abraham. Through his death and resurrection, we now can reclaim our status with our Father in heaven. And with his new covenant promise, made by his death through faith alone, our household lineage will be rejuvenated, and we will live again with God our Father when Christ returns. He's better because these promises won't ever fade, decay, or disappear. And we can have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises, because in the example that David creates, he does fulfill them. In the death Jesus suffered, he did fulfill his promise. So we can have faith that in Christ's return, he will fulfill his new promise and new covenant to us, because that's what God's anointed king does. Have faith that God's anointed king will fulfill his promises.